And Boker Tov, everybody. I think we're on. The title, if you saw it, because it's Parshat Bo this week, and the share I wanted to give, luckily I checked, there was a share I gave exactly a year ago about Moshe in the dark at Tochoshech. So I decided not to do that share again. But what I wanted to do, but I think I never did, is I never did a share with you on Magid itself or on Haggadah. So I want to take the opportunity that we're learning Parshat Bo this week, and believe it or not, it's only about 2 months till Pesach. That's a little scary thought sometimes. I wanted to take the week to take a couple sections of Magid and try to understand them in light of Parshat Bo. Okay, that's the idea. So just for a taster to start with, I want to take the first section of Magid, the famous Halach Ma'anya. If you got the source sheets, I printed out like a one-page Haggadah, but I'm going to share it with you over here. I'm sure everyone's familiar with this, with the beginning of Magid, right? And we have Kadesh, Urchatz, Karpas, Yachatz. We break the matzah, and after we break the matzah and show it to everybody, and hide half and show the other half, we say the following: Halach Ma'anya. Just for the fun of it, I'm going to pick on Phil. Okay, I can pick on you, Phil. Okay, I'm going to read the Hebrew. I want you to translate the English. Okay, just the way you usually understand it. Halach Ma'anya.
Phil has to unmute.
Unmute Phil, yeah, okay.
This is the bread of affliction.
Okay. Does anyone else translate it differently? Any other translation, this is the bread of affliction?
Yeah, the bread of speaking over, a note to answer.
To answer. Any other, what do most kids understand it as?
The poor person's bread.
Yeah. Good, poor man's bread. So those three opinions depends on they're all legitimate because ani means poor, oni means affliction, and la'anot means to answer. Or to start a conversation. Remember, Vanita v'amarti lifnei Hashem Elokecha? To talk about something, to make a proclamation. So all three fit with the Hebrew. The question was pshat, and I guess where it's coming from in Chumash. But we say halach ma'anya. Okay, now we'll continue. So this, I'll follow Phil, this bread of affliction. Continue, the achlu avutana ba'ara de Mitzrayim. Translate?
Our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt.
Okay. So that's point number one. Okay. Now continue. Kol dichvin yete ve'echal.
Whoever needs should come and eat.
Okay. Kol ditzrich yete ve'yifsach.
It should come along and share in the Korban Pesach.
Okay. Hashtahacha.
Now we're here.
L'shana haba ba'ara d'Yisrael.
I hate to say that. We are here. But
Okay.
Okay,
I wanted you to say Hashta Avde. Okay.
We are slaves.
Okay, because they're okay. I know no marriage strips. Okay. Okay.
We hope after the election we'll be free.
Okay. Now, is this the story of the Exodus? That's not. No, Magid should be the story of the Exodus, but this clearly is not the story of the Exodus. Agreed?
Agreed.
Yeah. So how is this understood? What's the function of this section? What, in essence, are we doing in 2-3 words or less?
It's an introduction.
Okay, but what are we doing? It doesn't say, but how are we introducing the story? Who are we inviting?
Whoever wants to come.
Yeah. And why are we inviting people? Is that something nice to invite? Is that a Jewish idea to invite people?
Because on the original Seder night or in Mitzrayim, everybody had to be together with families.
Yeah. We're going to see that soon. But in general, let me explain the classic question. The classic question is, let me turn off the share for a minute. Most people understand Kol Dichvin is an introduction, but also it's an invitation because we begin by inviting people who don't have. That's like the classic interpretation is we're opening up our house, we're opening up our Seder for visitors to come and visit. The problem with that is famous because why? If you're inviting people to your Seder, it's a little bit late, isn't it? We did Kadesh, Urchatz, Karpas, Yachatz. It's a little bit late to invite people. And the table is set already. So why would it be an invitation? Question number 2 was Phil's question. How can we say that next year in the land of Israel, and we say that in Israel, don't we? Yeah. So, and Hacha means, that's question what Hacha means. But we're hoping, how about if you're in Israel? We say this, don't we?
Yeah.
There's no, Korn Publishers didn't put out a a version of Magid for the land of Israel version, with only one day Yontav and things like that. We stayed in Israel. Hashta Avde sounds like we're still in slavery and we hope to be free next year. But I think for most people, they're not in slavery. They may feel like they're in slavery, but in general, we're not in slavery now. I'm pretty sure we're free. So therefore, all those questions makes it difficult to understand what we're talking about here. Okay. So someone mentioned, I guess they probably heard this before, but the way I explain it is that let me go back to share my screen. What I want to claim is that from over here, let me get what happened to why can't I annotate? I guess I can't annotate with this one. Okay, I don't have an annotate tool on this one. Okay, I forgot that from last time. Okay, I can do it like this. Over here, we need to put a quotation mark right over here before Kol Dichvin. And we're quoting our ancestors. In other words, this halach ma'anya, this poor man's bread or word of affliction, whatever we're going to call it, we just did yachas. We showed the matzah, and we're saying this is the same bread our forefathers ate in Egypt. And now we're going to quote our forefathers. Because what did our forefathers do? Before the first Korban Pesach, they had to invite one another to join in Korban Pesach. And this year here in the land of Egypt, next year hoping to be free. This year we're in slavery still. Next year we hope to be, this year here in Egypt, next year we hope to be in Israel. This year we're in slavery. Next year we hope to be free. But what I want to claim is that right now, starting with Kol Dichvin, we're not inviting anybody at present. We're quoting what our forefathers said in preparation for their first Passover. Make sense?
Yeah.
What's the source of that? If I go now to Parshat Shavua, if I go to Parshat Bo, let's open up a Tanakh over here. Wait a second, stop my share screen and open up my share screen. And you don't need my WhatsApp, you need my Tanakh. Here we go. If I open up a Tanakh to Sefer Shmot, Perek Yud Bet, the famous Parshat HaChodesh. What do we have? Actually, this one's better, my mistake. Here in Parshat HaChodesh, what do we have? In chapter 12 we need. God tells Moshe, start counting months from Rosh Chodesh. Tell Bnei Israel, on the 10th of the month, everyone should take a lamb per family. Listen carefully, now Pasuk Daled. If the family is too small, that not everyone can finish a lamb, you have to invite your neighbors, who is ever nearby, based on the number of people who can eat the lamb. So let's say it takes 25 people to finish off a lamb. So how many people do you invite? You have to invite 25. Let's say your family is only 5 or 6 people, so you have to get your neighbors and join in. Let's say, understand what we want to do? The first commandment was to make sure that the first Seder in Egypt, the Korban Pesach, had to be a large family meal. And if your family is small, it has to be a neighborhood meal. There was a commandment to form a group, and therefore we're commanded, our very first commandment in Egypt is to invite others and start building community. That's, I think, a very key thing. That the first commandment is not Rosh Chodesh. That's a commandment for the leadership. The first commandment for the people is to take initiative and form a group and build a family and build a household and build a community and sit and have a meal together. And you need to take initiative and invite people to make sure there's enough people to have a proper meal. And then, so that's why you need to do it on the 10th, to make sure you have enough time to make sure everything's prepared and you get a proper one, etc. And then you keep it to the 14th and you shecht it, and then you take the blood and you sprinkle it, and then you eat the basar that evening together with matzah. You're not just going to eat the meat by itself. You're going to have what Hillel calls a alafa or a shawarma. We're going to eat the meat together with matzah, which is like lafa back then, like with a thin pita and with salad. And it has to be properly cooked and no leftovers, and eat it properly dressed. And then that night it'll be makat b'chorot. And when God sees the blood, he'll pass over your house, and you'll be saved from makat b'chorot. And then we're told this: you have to this day when you bring the Korban Pesach in Egypt, you have to remember it forever and celebrate it every year forever, which is our Seder, isn't it?
Yeah.
So based on Parshat Bo and Parshat HaChodesh, if I go back now and look at our Haggadah, I think it makes a lot of sense now. Let me go back to share my screen. If I go back to Magid, what do we find? We broke the matzah. We're using the matzah, I think, as a conversation piece. And that's why that translation that this is conversation bread actually makes a lot of sense. It's a conversation bread to remember our affliction in Egypt. Right? And when we buy it, that one little joke, it makes us poor because it costs so much money. That was just a joke on Lachem Oni. I got my joke, poor man's bread, because it costs so much money. It makes you poor. No, but seriously, what I want to claim is Yachatz pretty much introduces Magid, because I show the matzah to everybody, I break it, and I tell the leader, really only the leader should say this, and say, this bread that I just broke, this piece of matzah, is the same matzah our forefathers ate in Egypt. When in Egypt? Not under slavery, at the first Seder. We're never told anywhere that we ate matzah in Egypt. Most likely we ate chametz in Egypt, because everyone in Egypt ate chametz, because chametz was the national bread of Egypt. Egypt was known for its fermentation. It doesn't say anywhere in Chumash that the Jews, as slaves, we were so poor we couldn't afford to bake regular bread, and we were so quick we only made pita and things like that. That's what they tell little kids in Gan, and it might even be true, but that's not the matzah we're referring to here. The first time we're commanded to eat matzah is at Korban Pesach, but we're still in Egypt, the day before we leave Egypt. But we're telling the people gathering, this is the same bread our forefathers ate in Egypt. And what did they have to do? They invited one another to join in the meal, to join the Korban Pesach. Remember, Ish Lefi Achlot Techos Alaseh. And when they sat down to that meal, they had their views to a better future. This year, still in Egypt. Next year, hopefully in the land of Israel. This year, still under slavery. Next year, we hope to be free. And in essence, what we're doing is we're connecting our Seder to the very first Seder, which is exactly Parshat Bo, isn't it? It's exactly Parshat HaChodesh, where God tells the people in Egypt, make this a special evening and have this anti-Egyptian meal. Remember, we'll take this Egyptian god and burn it in effigy, and that'll be the main course. Like if you're those who grew up in America, what's called a Thanksgiving dinner. So you're going to sit down to a family meal, but the cuisine at the meal will be symbolic of the theme. So because we saw beforehand in last week that to shech the lamb and eat it in Egypt was an abomination in the eyes of the Egyptians, and Egypt was known for its fermentation and making bread baking, then at this meal it's going to be sort of an anti-Egyptian meal. Because we're going to show we're rejecting Egyptian way of life, and we're going to turn over a new leaf and begin to serve our God. And that's why when we put the blood on our doors, God already knows who's Jewish. All the other plagues, when the Jews were saved, we didn't have to show something for God to know we're Jewish. But this one, we need to show God we're worthy of redemption. The blood on the doorpost doesn't show God who's Jewish. It shows God who's worthy of being redeemed, because we're willing now to follow his laws. So my first point I want to make is based again on Parshat Bo and Parshat HaChodesh, that halach ma'ani is referring to the matzah we ate at the first Seder. And when you sit down to a meal, listen to the logic. That's why I think with Chazal's opinion that lechem she'odim alav dvarim harbeh. It's called lechem oni because it's a conversation type. It's a bread that begins a conversation piece. If you're sitting down to a meal and usually you eat chametz, especially in Egypt, and now you're sitting down to a meal and you're purposely not having chametz, you're only eating matzah, that's going to spark a conversation, because you're going to ask, how come, why this cuisine? Why are we eating matzah instead of chametz? And that'll begin a conversation about why God's taking us out of Egypt. So I think it's very important that we begin our Seder by connecting our Seder to the very first Seder. And therefore, this whole section, is exactly connecting us to the very first Seder in Parshat HaChodesh, in chapter 12 in Shemot. Again, this year here in Egypt, next year hopefully to be in Israel. I'll show you what that is in Chumash in a minute. And the same way, this year we're still in slavery, next year we hope to be free. Why am I saying this year, hopefully in the land of Israel next year? Because if I go back to Parshat Shemot, this week's Parsha, and we read the commandment, that's God talking to Moshe. When Moshe tells the people this, Moshe tells all the people, Mishchu chulachem tzonim shpechatechem. Remember in chapter 12, verse 21, he tells them, go and take a Korban Pesach for every family and how to dip the blood, etc. And this will save you from Makat Bechorot. And then Ushmartem et hadavar hazeh, keep this forever, for a statue for you and your children forever. And here's the land, Vayaki tavo la'aretz. Hopefully next year, but the original plan was to be in Israel by next year. When you come to the land of Israel, Asher yiten Hashem lachem, kasher diber ushmartem et avodah hazot. Do this avodah of Korban Pesach. Do it also in the land of Israel. And when your kids ask you, hey, what's going on here? Tell them this is to remember how God saved us from Makat Bechorot and began our redemption process. So the Hashtahacha, the Shana Baba Ard Yisrael, and Hashta Abde, it's a perfect match for what our forefathers said back in Egypt. And therefore, again, if I go back to Magid again, and I ask myself, what's going on at the Seder? It's not an invitation. It's too late to invite people. And we're not talking. We're not inviting anybody. We're saying this is what our forefathers did. Our forefathers who ate the same matzah. They invited one another for their first Seder. They were in Egypt with hopes to be in Israel. They were in slavery with hopes to be free. And therefore, our Seder should not only be about the past, but also talking about a better future. I hope that was point number one. Okay. Point number two is Manishtana is in order to get the kids' attention. That's clear. And everyone knows there's only one question in Manishtana. It's not four. The question is, why are you trying to get my attention? In other words, all year long you ignore me. How come you're trying to get my attention tonight? The kids are not asking why we're eating matzah. They count onto it. You're trying to get my attention. How come you're changing things so much? How come there's so many different things tonight? There must be something going on. So then one question is, how come tonight's different? What are you trying to get my attention? And the kid brings 4 proofs you're trying to get my attention. And then we answer the kid with Avadim Hayinu. Now, this I'm pretty sure you know. You know who wrote the words Avadim Hayinu? Anyone know who wrote the words to this song? Yeah, what's the next line? When you sing it, do you also sing Ata b'nei chorim b'nei chorim? Or not? Yeah. A lot of people sing that, don't they? It's not in your Haggadah.
Oh.
It's not there. There's a good reason it's not there, because we say something very different in our Haggadah. Because we were slaves to Pharaoh, now we're servants of God. We're not free.
Ask a question.
But at that song, I don't know where it came from, but it's I guess they picked up with the Bnei Chorin over here and they mixed the two together.
Yeah.
From Halach Ma'anya. Now,
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Isn't the Manishtana in the wrong place? Because it's talking about stuff that only happens later in the Seder. The matzah, the yarakot. Why here? Why put it here when they put it later when they're actually doing it?
Well, the matzah we saw already, didn't we?
Yeah.
We showed the matzah. It's on the table.
Yeah.
We see the matzah. We already dipped already. We dipped twice. What else was there? We're leading. That's something we've done already. I'm pretty sure we've done them already, right? We're leading. We're dipping. I forgot the Manishtan. It's been a long time since I sang it. Matzah instead of chametz, leading thing. Moror. If we did karpas with moror, it's also the same. We saw moror already also. So I'm pretty sure we saw them all.
Okay.
Okay. Now we're going to do the main thing in Parshat Bo. And that is, what's this commandment? What's the source of Magid? Why are we obligated to tell the story? So quote me the pasuk everybody quotes. Everyone knows that by heart, correct? Now, what I want to do now is I want to study that section in Chumash about Avigata Levincha and try to understand what's shot of that pasuk in Chumash, and later that to understand the Seder. Okay, so now we're going to start the main part of the share. Let me close up the chat. And we're going to open up a Chumash, and I'm going to do it nice and easy on a source sheet, not this one, on this one here. Made it nice and simple with English. I'm sort of giving things away on this one. Actually, you know what? I shouldn't do this. My mistake. We have to look in a Chumash first and not give everything away. Just a quick review in Parshat, in Perek Yud Bet. We have this commandment called Pesach and the story of the Exodus, and it's been 430 years. But we're out of Egypt. That's the main thing. We're out of Egypt and we're on the road already. After we left Egypt, the day after we left Ramses and we're in Sukkot, and we had matzah. In Perek Gimel begins as follows: Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor, Kadesh li kol bechor peter kol rechem b'vnei Yisrael b'adam v'b'behema lihu. In case you don't have a chumash, you can open up your tefillin. You'll see this in your tefillin also. Now, God says to Moshe, tell Bnei Israel to set aside every firstborn and dedicate it to God. Not to sacrifice them, but to work basically to be in civil service serving God. That was the original plan, and we later switched that job to the Levites. What should Moshe do now? Moshe should tell the people this law. Instead, Moshe tells the people something else. V'yomer Moshe elam. What's Moshe tell the people? Remember this day that you left Egypt, because God took you out of Egypt with that outstretched hand, and don't eat chametz. Everyone look at Pasuk Gimel again. I'm going to read it one more time. V'yomer Moshe elam. Zechor et hayom hazeh asher yitzatem mimitzrayim bebeit avadim, ki b'chol zeh yad hotzi Hashem etchem mizeh v'lo echal chametz. I'm gonna, maybe I'll use the chat. How many commandments are here? Is it one or two? Just for the fun of it. Anyone who wants to use the chat? Just say, is it one commandment or two commandments? How'd you understand that? Remember this day you left Egypt and don't eat chametz. Let's see if anyone's listening. Just write one or two. And now I can see, I don't see the chat. Here we go. There's my chat. Oh, here we go. Okay, two. We got 1, 2. 2. 2. Okay. I guess it was an easy question. Okay. I guess everyone's saying 2. Well, I guess there's a good reason why everyone's saying 2. You know why? Because it sounds like 2 commandments, right? Remember this day you left Egypt. Okay. And not to have chametz. Now, the first commandment is a once-a-year commandment or an everyday commandment? Do we have to do this every day or once a year?
Every day.
Every day. How about this commandment? Don't eat chametz every day or once a year?
7 days.
Once a year, right? Otherwise, we're in big trouble. So it's interesting. Why would one commandment be what? Be every day, and another one only once a year? Number 2. Also, what's the connection between them? Is there any connection between remembering this day and not eating chametz? If you're supposed to remember the day you left Egypt, why would not having chametz remind you of the day you left Egypt? Let's take a look at the chat real fast. I agree with Harold. It's not clear that the commandment is every day. If I follow, we know there's an everyday commandment to remember the Exodus. We haven't heard that yet. Instead, it makes more sense that we just left Egypt. It's the morning after we left Egypt. Remember, we baked matzah for, let me just go back real fast to Perek Yud Bet. Just a quick reminder. In Perek Yud Bet, Pasuk Lamed Zayin, after we left Egypt in the 10th plague, first of all, when we were leaving, in Pasuk Lamed Gimel, we were rushed out of Egypt. We didn't take the dough. We took the dough and ran. Not because we were in a rush. The Egyptians were rushing us out so we could go serve our God. That's the show we did last year. And then we borrowed all these things. We leave Egypt. We left from Ramses. We did 1 day's travel. We got to Sukkot. We set up camp. Okay? And Erev was with them. And what did we eat when we arrived in Sukkot? Because we didn't have time to eat before we left Egypt. We took the dough that we took out in a rush because we were expelled from Egypt and we couldn't linger, and we had no other supplies, and therefore the only thing we had to eat was dough. And we took the dough, and because we didn't have our ovens and dough didn't rise properly because we were rushing out at night, therefore we baked it matzah, basically like simple pita in the morning, and that's it. And then we conclude it's been 430 years, and then Alel Shimurim, and that's it. And then this section about this goes back to beforehand about Korban Pesach Haskem with Brit Milah, and then in the next chapter, in chapter 13, I'm going to skip the first 2 psukim. Moshe tells the people, remember this day that you left Egypt, because God took you out with a strong hand, and don't eat chametz. Now, if this said, remember the day you left Egypt and eat matzah, wouldn't that make more sense? If if eating matzah was not the normal thing that people did in Egypt, people usually ate chametz. I'm going to make up a story, which will take us through the whole share, okay? Let me forget this one. I'm going to make up a real story that didn't happen. Maybe it did happen. It's most of you grew up in America, I think. You've heard of Camp Stone or summer camps? I'll make up a story about camp. It can be any camp. And the campers go on a hike. Right? They go on a hike. And we're talking about like 30 years ago, before there were cell phones. Maybe you had walkie-talkies and stuff. So they're going on a hike and an overnight. So there's a camp truck that takes all the supplies and the tents and all the sleeping bags and everything, to the camping site. And the campers everyone gets a little knapsack. So what happened? So the camp gets a surplus cereal. That's how they get. So you know what Crispex is? Crispex is a type of an American cereal. I'll just make up the name. You might have heard of it. Maybe yes, maybe no. They don't sell it in Israel. But it's not the most common cereal. It's not like Cheerios and Corn Flakes and Rice Krispies. It's a little off-brand. But there were a lot. They had surplus. So every student, it's like what's it like? Crispex? I don't know. It's like Kariot or something like that. Whatever it is. So every kid got for his knapsack a little box of Crispex to put in their knapsack to snack on. For the right, because until they get to the camping site. So they walk like 3-4 hours. They get to where they're supposed to have lunch, and the camp truck was supposed to meet them there, but the camp truck wasn't there. The walkie-talkies are working. The battery didn't work. So, okay. So what did they eat for lunch? Everyone had their box of Crispex. Got it? Now, they walk another 3 hours. They get to the campsite where they're supposed to set up a night, and supposed to have a cookout and everything, and they're supposed to have hot dogs and hamburgers, all the thing. And guess what? The camp truck's still not there because it had broken down. Everyone's starving, and the only thing they have to eat is the little bit that's left in the Crispex boxes. Okay, so one of the they were like 14, 15-year-olds. One of the girls, like 15, was crying, all depressed, like homesick and everything. And one of the madrichim was a couple, like 18 or 19. He came over, helped her out, shared his Crispex with her, gave her, calmed her down, etc. That's how they met. And of course, 3 years later, they got married. Understand? And the rest is like a fairy tale. Now, after they got married, on their first anniversary, actually, I forgot something. In the Cheder Yichud, he brought Crispex, okay? Understand why he did that? To know how they met. On their first anniversary, because he was cheap, what they had for breakfast? He makes sure to buy a box of Crispex. And every year on the anniversary, they would have Crispex for breakfast. And to them, what did that mean? That reminded them of how they met. Hope you follow my story. I'm sure you're catching on already, right? 30 years later, what do all the kids in the family know? There's 4 kids. And every morning, what do the kids have? Every year, it was August 7th, right? We know in our family, we have Crispex for breakfast. Why? It's mommy and daddy's anniversary. Why? I'm not sure why. That's what we do. 20 years later, the grandchildren are keeping up the same family minhag. You understand? Now, those grandchildren only know that on August 7th every year, we have Crispex once a year for some reason. And it's something about Bubby and Zadie's anniversary. The only way they would understand why they're doing it if their parents would tell them, you know why we're eating Crispex every year in the summer? Because that's when Bubby and Zadie met. You follow? Eating Crispex on August 7th would be meaningless unless you told the story. For the first generation, I don't need to tell the story. They lived through the story. Okay? And therefore, what's Moshe telling the people? You just left Egypt. This was like a monumentous event. But what typified the event was, because you were rushed out of Egypt and you didn't have time to prepare, the only thing you had to eat was matzah. That's all you had. You just had that dough and you baked it matzah. You had nothing else to eat. You remember there was fish and watermelon and remember all the things people remember in Egypt. They weren't starving in Egypt. There was lots of food in Egypt. Remember Zachanot HaDaga? And it was on sale all the time. Everyone knows what they say later on. And what reminds them of the experience was the fact the only thing they had to eat on that trip was matzah. Therefore, he says, remember this day. Okay? And how are you going to remember this day forever? He should say, eat matzah and you remember the event. For some reason, he says, instead of saying eat matzah, he says, don't eat chametz. But let's go back now to the pasuk. If the pasuk said only, remember this day you left Egypt forever. I think on the anniversary, remember this anniversary, we just left Egypt. and eat matzah, that would make a lot of sense. The problem is that don't eat chametz. But now Moshe's got to clarify what he means. Today we're leaving in the spring, and this is going to prove it's a once-a-year commandment, not an everyday commandment. When you come to the land of Israel, as you promised your forefathers, do this avodah in this month. What avodah? Eat matzah for 7 days. Now it makes sense. On the anniversary every year of the Exodus, which is in the spring, eat matzah for 7 days. When you eat matzah, that'll remind you of how God took you out of Egypt and how momentous the event was. Right? And then on the last day, have a holiday. Okay? Matzot yechel shivat yamim. Eat matzah for all 7 days. And you can't have any chametz. Okay? Now, that makes sense to what generation? In other words, lo yacha chametz, once it's explained in the next 3 psukim, makes sense of what? If it really means eat matzah. So there's a question, why not be more clear in the opening commandment? But Moshe clarifies it as we go on. The question that's going to come up later on, why are we focusing more on not eating chametz than eating matzah? But once I understand that you're supposed to eat matzah for 7 days, the way a lot of Parshim understand it, once I say you can't have chametz, then of course you eat matzah. There's nothing else to eat. But what I'm saying is that generation left Egypt. All they need to do is eat matzah and nothing else, and not have chametz. That would remind them of the Exodus. The problem is the kids won't know. And therefore, this is meaningless unless, for the future generations, now we get to our pasuk. On the day that you eat matzah, what do you tell your children? Explain why. Explain the reason to your children because they didn't go through the experience. Now, I'm going to show you this on a different screen, and then we're going to have some fun. Because everyone knows this pasuk by heart, but no one pays attention to how complicated it is. So now I'm going to just review what we said. Moshe tells the people, remember this day you left Egypt, okay? And don't eat chametz. Got it? I want to claim it's 1 commandment, not 2 commandments. The way we remember the day we left Egypt is by not eating chametz. That's why I asked you that question in the beginning. What I want to claim is this isn't 2 commandments, it's 1 commandment. Remember every year on the anniversary, remember this day by not having chametz. What's my proof? Just keep reading. It's once a year in the spring. And the main thing you need to do is eat matzah for 7 days. And therefore, by not eating chametz, you'll remember that day. But of course, the main reason you remember is by eating chametz. By not eating chametz and hence eating matzah for 7 days. And then that'll remind you of the experience. But then that's only meaningful to the people who went out of Egypt. How about your children who don't know? Therefore, on the same day, on that anniversary, in the spring, when you start eating matzah, you have to explain to your children. Now we're going to translate it, okay? Vigata levincha bayomahu. What's bayomahu? What day is that referring to? In this context, what's bayomahu referring to?
The day you went out of Egypt, the first day.
14th of Nisan at night.
No, it says a day, not night. On what day? What day is this referring to?
It's the
The
Seder.
anniversary.
Hayom atem yotzim b'chodesh aviv. It could be the day after you left Egypt. It could be, or maybe it's Rosh Chodesh. Maybe it's Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Maybe. Could this mean Rosh Chodesh Nisan?
We're only having a story on the night, so that's.
Listen, last year my Seder. Someone came up with that idea.
Just froze.
Sure they did. Look. Does this sound familiar? Remember this, Yochel mi Rosh Chodesh? Remember saying that, Yochel mi Rosh Chodesh, Tamalom Rabbi Yamahu?
Yeah.
You remember, we just say it, we don't know what we're talking about, agreed? What's it mean? I might think my obligation to tell the story begins on Rosh Chodesh. Why would I think that? A, because Parshat HaChodesh, the first commandment was given on Rosh Chodesh. And what did we just read? Right before we got to Levimcha? Said, Hayom atem yotzim b'chodesh aviv. What we just read doesn't say anything about what day you do this. It says, when you come to the land of Israel in the spring, do this avodah. So I might think, when do I tell the story? When do I fulfill Vigat Levimcha? On the first day of the spring, b'chodesh aviv. Okay? Tamlom Rabbi Mahu. on that day, on the same day probably that you left Egypt, maybe. Maybe on the day, on the 14th beforehand, then Tamalomer Bavur Zeh. And then we'll get to this limud in a minute. I'll return to this pasuk in a minute. Let's go back to the psukim. Okay? I'm trying to show you that in your Haggadah, you refer to this pasuk all the time without realizing it. Because this pasuk defines our obligation to tell the story every year. That's why it's called Magid, because we're fulfilling Figat Levimcha. So you tell your children on that day, on what day? Well, on the day I think you started eating matzah. That makes more sense. And when you're eating matzah for 7 days, you get rid of your chametz. Now the question, when you get rid of your chametz on the day before. That's Yacham Ibod Yom, understand? But you eat matzah at night. So text on that day, Lemor saying, Bavur Zeh. What's Zeh referring to in this pasuk? Someone tell me to make sure you understand. Simple pshat. What's Zeh referring to?
The matzah.
It's got to be the matzah. Agreed? Eat matzah for 7 days, and tell your children on the day you start eating matzah. Explain to them why you're eating matzah. And what do you explain? For the sake of this matzah, God did for me. What did God do for me? Yeah, He took us out of Egypt with miracles when we left Egypt. God did. Explain to your children when you're eating matzah. Explain what? Okay. Now I should really do a poll. I don't have a poll here, so we'll do chat again. I'm going to write in the chat also now. Let me open the chat. I'm going to write my question in the chat, and I want you guys to reply to it. Not everyone needs to participate, but here's my question. Okay. I'll get to Michael's question in a minute. According to Chumash, there's a commandment to eat matzah for 7 days. It says it 7 times. The rabbis don't think there is.
Right.
If we have time, we'll talk about that later on. But according to Chumash, it says Shivat Kamim Tocha Matzot. That's a command like any command, isn't it?
Yep.
Why the rabbis don't think so, by the end of this year, we'll have a better understanding why. But here's my question. Am I supposed to explain to my children, let me get my thing, why I'm eating matzah? That's possibility 1. That's A. Okay, that's A. Oh, that's big A. Okay, that would be A. Sorry. Or why Hashem took me out of Egypt. That'll be B. I'll explain my question. Chumash tells you have to tell your children something. Am I supposed to explain to my children why I'm eating matzah? Or am I supposed to explain to my children why God took me out of Egypt? Think about it for a minute and then write A or B. You follow? You're supposed to tell something to your children. You're supposed to tell your children on that day, on the day, I guess you started eating matzah, you're supposed to tell your children, for the sake of this, right, God did for me coming out of Egypt. So am I supposed to explain why I'm eating matzah or why God took me out of Egypt? So far we got 2 B's. Both, okay. B. Okay, just answers both. Okay. A, okay. We eat the matzah only to remember B, okay. No more A's, okay. Oh, a Jewish answer, okay. Okay, and, we never explained B. Very good, Larry. Okay. Okay, so at least you guys understood my question. Okay, A, okay. Now, first let me explain why A is right, and then we'll explain why A is wrong. Okay, but don't feel bad, it's a machloket. The machloket between A and B is a machloket parshanim. Later in your Seder, you're gonna follow Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel says you have to explain to your children at your Seder, remember? Pesach Matzah Maror. Remember, Rabbi Gamliel says if you don't explain these 3 things, you're not fulfilling your thing. And we explain why I'm eating matzah. Matzah zu ashuma, shanochlim ashuma. Why do we eat matzah? Because we didn't have time to bake our dough. Right? And when God took us out of Egypt, it took us out. And we quote the pasuk we just read that we ate. We took the dough and made matzah out of it. Kilo chametz, okay, because we were thrown out of Egypt. It was so quick. So if I follow what we do in our Seder to fulfill Rabbi Gamliel, what do we say? We're explaining reading matzah to remember how God took us out of Egypt. And that's A, which is the classic explanation. I'm eating matzah, And if I go back to my Crispix analogy from camp, that's exactly why I'm eating Crispix every year on August 7th, to remind me of how Babi and Zaidi met. But if I follow the pasuk in Hebrew, let's go back to the pasuk in our source. If bavur means for the sake of, not biglal, a bavur is for the sake of, it says for the sake, you're supposed to tell your children, for the sake of this matzah, God took me out of Egypt. It sounds like God took me out of Egypt so that I would eat matzah, which sounds ridiculous, right? If I just follow the simple Hebrew, I'm supposed to explain to my children, you know what? The whole reason God took me out of Egypt, why did God take me out of Egypt? In order that I could eat matzah. For the sake of this matzah, God did for me all these miracles, take me out of Egypt, which makes no sense at all. Because we always think, I eat matzah, remember that He took me out of Egypt. I don't explain to my children that God took me out of Egypt to eat matzah. That sounds almost ridiculous. On the other hand, that's what the Hebrew seems to be saying. So what most people think is that it should be really zeh bavor. That's what some Parshim are going to say. It really means, it should be zeh bavor. That this is because the word bavor should go here, zeh bavor. We'll see that possibility. So let's take a look at, my source sheet here. I'm going to show you the machloket. Okay, how to understand bavor zeh. We'll explain to Hashem. Why did Hashem take me out, or why am I eating matzah? So listen to what Rashi says. Rashi says as follows. Rashi on this pasuk, bavor zeh, ba'avor shaykei mitzvotav kagon pesach matzah maror. Rashi holds B, doesn't he? Rashi says, I explained to my children the reason why God took me out of Egypt was so that I could keep mitzvot like eating pesach matzah maror. In fact, mitzvot and matzot is spelled almost the same way. Right? The word matzot and mitzvot, mitzvotav, if I just take mitzvot, I just take out the tav and I have matzot. Pretty much. So a bit of a wordplay. But what Rashi is saying, I'm supposed to explain to my children that God took me out of Egypt to keep his mitzvot like eating pesach matzah maror. Now, Ibn Ezra, we'll see, is going to quote who Ramban quotes pretty much. He says, bavor zeh. What's he say? Omar Rab Marinos, he quotes someone who lived before the Ramban, a contemporary of Rashi. Pirush bavor zeh, listen carefully. Haya ro'oi liot hafuch. The pasuk shouldn't say bavor zeh, it should say zeh ba'avor. Understand? That's why you understand. That's why anyone who said A understood it. Zeh ba'avor shasa shamli. That's a simple understanding of the word. Rab Marinos is what almost all of us do at our Seder. We explain to our children, I'm eating matzah to remember that God took me out of Egypt. It's not bavor. God didn't take me out of Egypt to eat matzah. I'm eating matzah to remember that God took me out of Egypt, to say thank you. Vevi Rabim Kamoda Dato, he brought a lot of other examples where, let me make this a bit bigger. He brought many other examples, Vevi Rabim Dato, other examples where I can switch words around. Like zeh bavor and bavor zeh, that happens a lot in times I can switch two words around. Then he says, that's Ibn Ezra quotes Rabbi Marinos, who Ramban also follows. Ulefi da'ati, Ibn Ezra says, ein echad mehem nachon. Not one example he brings is correct. Not only is he wrong here, every example he brings is wrong. Ki ech napoch divrei Elohim chayim. It's cute. Yeah, Ibn Ezra is really sharp here, isn't he? Because ech napoch divrei Elohim. He says, he goes, V'tama pasuk hefech machshavto. He's really on the ball here, Ibn Ezra, isn't he? He's really he says, the guy misread the pasuk. I'm not eating matzah to remember that God took me out of Egypt. Let me switch before I read farther. Let me explain where we're going to go with this. Ibn Ezra is saying, I don't eat matzah to remember what happened. I'm eating matzah to remember why it happened. In other words, I'm not eating matzah to say thank you out of gratitude. Oh, thank you for taking me out of Egypt. I'm eating matzah to remember the purpose of the Exodus. And therefore he says, Pirosh bavor zeh, bavor zot havodah, she'achilat hamatzah v'lo yechal chametz. Shu tchilat hamitzvot she'tziva lenu Hashem. Now we're back to Parshat HaChodesh. Okay? The very first commandment we received was to have a Seder and make matzah, and eat korban pesach, etc. So it says, bavor zeh, for the sake of this avodah, which is eating matzah for 7 days every year in the spring, and not having chametz. which is the beginning of what? Of the mitzvot. I'm going to go back and see why. I have to go back to the question why v'lo yachal chametz is so central here. Right? Asalanu Hashem otot ad sheyotzenu miMitzrayim. God did all these miracles in order that we keep His mitzvot. And now comes this biggest statement. Let me get rid of this part. Listen carefully now. V'hatam lo tzianu miMitzrayim rak le'ovdo. The whole purpose of Yitzet Mitzrayim was in order to serve Him. I don't need to remember what happened. I need to remember why it happened. That's what makes it relevant 5,000 years later. Because I'm not saying thank you. Oh God, I was in trouble. You saved me. I need to remember there's a purpose in my national history. Now, for children, that's why the answer for children is A. The answer for adults is B. The answer for children is, you know what? If God didn't take us out of Egypt, we'd still be slaves. I think we're going to say that in our Haggadah. A simple answer is, I'm eating matzah to remember that God took us out of Egypt. That reminds me of the event, almost like the reason we eat turkey on Thanksgiving. That's just to remember, to sort of say thank you for our founding fathers, or for the people who started to colonize the early settlers. Same here. That's a simple understanding. But that's just saying, no, it's much deeper. The main thing we have to tell our children, at least our more mature children, is there's a purpose in our history, and there's a reason why God took us out of Egypt. And that is in order to become His nation. And what's His proof? For Katuv, we say this every day. When we mention the Exodus every day in davening, the last Parshat of Kriyat Shema, Parshat Tzitzit, Ani Hashem Elokechem, Asher Tzeit Etchem Eretz Mitzrayim, Liot Lachad Elohim. The last line of Shema we say every day, we remind ourselves, Am Hashem your God, who took you out of Egypt in order to be your God, to be your boss. When we remember the Exodus, we're not remembering what happened, we need to remember why it happened. And if God's going to be involved in our history, it's in order that we become His people. Now, that's going to bring us back to like a big argument or discussion of what's the reason for the Exodus. Because we're going to have two different approaches in Chumash itself. Does God redeem us from Egypt because we're suffering? Or does God redeem us from Egypt because He wants to bring us to Har Sinai? Remember, does God see an afflicted people in trouble? And there's a universal theme. I'll quote Martin Luther King. I've let my people go. The way the story of the Exodus is universally understood, it's a story of oppression, of a tyrant superpower taking advantage of a migrant people, and they have the right to freedom, and no one can oppress another person, another nation, another people. And that indeed is a universal theme of the Exodus, and that's reason enough for God to take us out of slavery, because it's not fair what's happening. But there's another reason that we saw in the beginning of Parshat Ve'era, Veskor Briti. There's a brit that God made with Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, not just to give the land of Israel, but to become God's people. And the additional reason for the Exodus is not just to save an oppressed people, but to make them His nation, to train them, and to give them mitzvot, and to serve God forever. That would be the covenantal reason for the Exodus. And those two reasons are reflected in the two ways to read the pasuk. I want to claim is the pasuk is intentionally ambiguous because it can be understood as A or B. What's the proof it can go by A or B? It's a machloket rishonim about how to understand the pasuk. It's a machloket at our seders how we explain the reason. Do we explain to our children the reason for the Exodus was the reason for the matzah is to thank God for taking us out of Egypt, or the reason for the Exodus was in order that we become a nation to keep His mitzvot like eating matzah, not just to eat matzah, but to keep mitzvot like eating matzah. Okay, now we'll get to Zeb being the temple service. Well, depends what avodah means. I'll answer Larry's question in a minute. Now, I want to show you a beautiful source for Rashi and Ibn Ezra. That the main reason we're eating matzah is to remember not Daddy took me out of Egypt, but why. And we're going to I'll share my screen again. And here we go. Where are we? We are in, I'll just use this source. That's good. We'll skip the Mishnah here. In Sefer Dvarim, let me stop for a minute. Let me go back to my Tanakh and open up Sefer Dvarim for a minute. Just a reminder, so you know what's going on in Tanakh. In Sefer Dvarim, let me switch to, this one's fine. I'm sorry. Okay, let's go to Dvarim. In Perek Vav, I'm sure you're familiar, is the famous Shema. But let's go chapter 6 in Sefer Dvarim real fast. Okay. Moshe says, this is the mitzvah that's coming up. The mitzvah, chukim mishpatim, that God commanded me to teach you to keep in the land. Okay. Notice, Moshe saying, what I'm about to teach you in this speech are all the mitzvot and chukim you have to keep when you come in the land. It's the 40th year. And Moshe tells them, Shemati Yisrael, keep all these laws for your own good, etc. Then he says, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, the famous line. Then he says, V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha, all that stuff. Remember all these things on your heart. Teach them to your children, etc. When you come to the land of Israel and everything's so good, don't forget God in your affluence. And says, don't test God. Now listen. Shmor tishmor kol mitzvot Hashem Elokechem. Keep all God's laws. V'sita hayashar b'tov b'nei Hashem. All the classic Sefer Dvarim speech. Then starts Pasuk Chaf. Ki shalcha bincha machar lemor ma ha'idot v'chukim v'mishpatim asher tziva Hashem Elokeinu etchem. Now, we quote this. This is the Chacham's question later in the Haggadah, but we didn't get to the Haggadah yet. In Sefer Dvarim, it says, should your children ask you, okay, actually, how do you translate the word ma? Does any normal kid ask, what are the laws that we have to keep? That's not the question, is it? Moshe just said, keep all these commandments. No normal kid in the right mind is going to ask their parents, what laws do we have to keep? What are they going to ask? Why do we have to keep the laws? The question isn't what are the laws? The question is for what? What's the purpose of all these laws? Let's see, got it right here. Yeah. What mean these testimonies? Okay, I don't like that translation too well, but he's saying, should your children ask you, because when you come to land and you bring up a family and you keep all these laws and have all these customs and laws, your kids are bound to ask you, what's the purpose of all these laws? Okay? Now, starting from the answer goes from Chaf Aleph to Chaf Hey. I want everyone to read for a minute. Take a minute and then we'll take a vote. Read from Aleph for Chaf Hey. Oh, in case you didn't realize, here's Avadim Hayinu. Isn't that interesting? That what we answer, the Manishtana, is actually the answer to the question, what's the purpose of all the laws? But I'm going to explain soon why we quote Avadim Hayinu in our Seder for the Manishtana. But to appreciate why, you have to do this carefully. I'll read from Chaf Aleph to Chaf Hey, and then we're going to vote, what's the actual answer? Should your kid ask you, what's the purpose of keeping all these laws? So he says, tell your children we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. God took us out of Egypt with that outstretched hand. And God did all these miracles and amazing things to the Egyptians in front of our own eyes. God did all these things for us. He took us out of Egypt in order, Laman, Haviotanu, to take us out of Egypt, to bring us to the land of Israel like he promised our forefathers. Okay? And God commanded us all these laws. So we learned to fear him. L'tov lanu, for our own good, for all the days, and to keep us alive in the land. In other words, these laws are good for our existence. They're good to keep us alive. If we keep them, God will be good to us and will keep us alive. Utstakati alanu. In fact, it's the right thing to do and the proper thing to do. Should we keep these laws in front of our God as he commanded us? It's not just only good for us, it's also the proper thing to do. It's a proper and righteous thing to do. Now, of all these psukim, which one is the main answer? Is Avadim Hayinu the reason why we keep the laws? Now, you understand that the reason begins in Pasuk Chaf Aleph and goes to Chaf Hey. But which of all these psukim would you say is the main reason? If your kid asks you, why keep this crazy diet or why keep all these laws? What's in it for me? Which one do you say makes more sense? Here, I'll just check the chat real fast. Okay, chat, and here we go. 24, 20, oh, okay. Anyone in Torah Mitzion Kolo would say 23. A New Herald would say 23, but people who read Chumash will say 24. Okay. I wanted to see 24, but I think you agree. Let me change my screen for a minute. Most people say 24 or 25. Let me explain why. Here, now we have it on this thing. Okay. So God took us out. Why? Okay. God commanded us to keep all these laws, to fear God, l'tov lanu, for our own good, and to keep us alive, and it's the right thing to do. So if your kid asks you, why keep all these laws? It's for our own good, and it's the right thing to do. But before we tell them that, before we say these laws are good for us, you know what, little kid? Listen carefully. What do we tell our children? You know what? We were once slaves in Egypt. And the whole reason why God took us out of Egypt was why? Was to give us this land and so that we can keep the laws. According to Harold, the whole reason God took us out of Egypt was to get the land of Israel. That would be a very good Torah Mitzion for it, which is probably true, is to fulfill Brit Avot. But on the other hand, the whole reason he gave us the land of Israel so we can keep his mitzvot in the land of Israel, which is stage 2. But what this whole section is saying is explain to your children that what? That the reason why God took us out of Egypt, out of slavery, and redeemed us and did all these miracles was in order to keep the mitzvot. Isn't that Moshe Rabbeinu in Sefer Dvarim? Hope you get my point. Okay? That's right. The Hebrew here said the word is Laman. In order to bring us to the land, but then if I go back to Bereshit, the reason he gave us the land was to be a nation, to be a people, we can keep his mitzvot. And that's why if we don't keep the mitzvot, he'll throw us out of the land. All I'm showing you is what Rashi and Ibn Ezra said on Bigat Levincha is exactly Moshe Rabbeinu in Sefer Dvarim. I'm just going to repeat that to make sure it's clear. How did Rashi and Ibn Ezra explain Bigat Levincha? The main thing you need to tell your children is not that he took you out of Egypt, but why he took you out of Egypt. And he took you out of Egypt to keep his mitzvot. Moshe Rabbeinu in Sefer Dvarim says the exact same thing. Should your children ask you, what's the purpose of keeping all these laws? Before you tell your children they're for your good, they're for your health, they'll keep you alive, tell them more than that. The entire reason why God chose you and he redeemed you and did miracles for you and took you out of Egypt, out of slavery, and gave you the land of Israel was in order to keep these mitzvot. Which is exactly the Bigat Levincha. And that's why, what words does Agada choose to answer the Manishtana at the very beginning? As soon as we get our child's attention and he asks the questions, what's special about tonight? The answer that Agada gives is Avadim Hayinu. Understand? It doesn't give the long answer, that's too complicated. We truncate the answer and make it nice and simple. We'll see in a minute what we do in Haggadah. But I want you to appreciate why, 2 things. Why this section in Sefer Dvarim follows Ibn Ezra's explanation and Rashi's explanation in Sefer Shmot of Bigat Levincha. And the main point it's making is that when I remember the Exodus, I'm not remembering what happened, but why it happened. Not only what happened, but also why it happened. It's not only gratitude, it's also purpose. Now, for little children, that's too complicated. Kids need a nice simple answer, but for adults, I think it's a more important message. And now I'm going to show you how the Haggadah finds the balance. Okay? Okay, yeah. So we'll talk about the circular reason. We'll get to Harold in a minute. Okay. Now let's go back to Haggadah because we're going to run out of time in a minute. Let's go back to Magid and I'm sorry, here we go. Let's go back now to our Seder and make this a little bit smaller. Okay, let's move up a little bit. Here we go. So in our Seder, remember first we connected ourselves to Parshat Bo and Parshat HaChodesh in our first Seder. We get our children's attention. In order to fulfill Bigat Levincha, if the kids aren't paying attention, you can't fulfill the commandment. So the first thing we need to do is get our children's attention by changing things. So the kids will ask questions, what's special about tonight? And how do we answer them? Let's take a look again. I'm sorry. Our first answer is nice and simple. We explain to our children, Avadim Hayinu Faru Mitzrayim, and God took us out b'yad chazakah. That's a direct quote from Sefer Dvarim, isn't it? We don't continue the quote. That's too complicated because we're talking about simple kids. And if God didn't take us out, we'd still be slaves. Now, you don't buy that because if God didn't take us out, who knows what would have happened? I doubt we'd still be slaves in Egypt because Egypt changed. There's so many dynasties. Who knows? There was an Arab spring, an Arab fall, an Arab winter. Everything changed. But that's a nice, simple answer for kids. But what's the danger? If it's only to remember what happened and give a simple answer for kids, then it's not relevant to adults. And as soon as I answer my children this nice, simple answer, then I tell them basically, go hide the afikomen. And I have to go right away to adults. Because the second I say Bigat Levincha is my main machayiv, is my main reason why I have to tell the story, I might think the story is only for children and adults don't have to be involved in the story. And therefore, right away, I switch the topic. And you know what? Even know-it-alls, even, Chacham Kavim, everyone everyone, even if you know the entire Torah, you're still commanded to tell the story, and the more you tell, the better. Do you understand what it's countering? Because when I read the pasuk the first time around, I might think it's only about for children, and it's only for kids, it's only nice and simple. Haggadah right away tells you, don't lose the adults. They also have to be involved in the story, because if I remember why we're chosen, then that's meaningful for adults as well. Not just what I don't just need to know the information. Oh, I know that story. I need to remember what's the importance of the story, and how that story has to be transformative and leads to our understanding of how we serve God. Now, then I bring a proof that know-it-alls have to tell the story. That's the five big rabbis in Bnei Brak who tell the story, and that proves. Now, it's paragraph 4 proves this point of paragraph 3. And then, for some reason, for a very good reason, we quote one of those 5 rabbis, was Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah. We quote his conversation saying, I never understood why we have to mention it every day and every night. And then he quotes a pasuk from Devarim, which is nice. We're saying, here he says, even though we tell the story once a year, the main commandment, the reason we go crazy once a year is to make sure I remember it every day. It was the main mitzvah of the Exodus. I think I used this analogy before. For Mother's Day, let me turn off I've got it for a minute. Remember the machloket Rishonim, whether we celebrate Mother's Day or not? Do we ever do that analogy? Yes, no, you remember? I'll tell you. There's a machloket. When do you guys paskin? Do we celebrate Mother's Day or not?
Celebrate it every day.
That's Shitat Chachamim. Shitat Chachamim is every day's Mother's Day. Wise men, hold that. Rabbi Hallmark. You've heard of Rabbi Hallmark? He paskins, we celebrate once a year as Mother's Day.
You as a Jew.
My card. Understand the machloket? Now, what's the reason? Because if you celebrate Mother's Day, maybe you'll forget about Mother the rest of the year. Now, what's Rabbi Hallmark say? You have to celebrate Mother's once because he has to make a living. You have to make greeting cards. But the idea is, what's the idea behind it? Put it this way: how do we paskin? Mikar Adin, every day is Mother's Day. We paskin like Chachamim, but we're machmir, aren't we? We also celebrate Mother's Day. But why do we do that? To make sure that every day is Mother's Day, we celebrate Mother's Day. You have the analogy? I celebrate once a year, Mother's Day, once a year, to make sure that every day is Mother's Day. Same thing, the Exodus. Every day I need to remember the Exodus because the memory of the Exodus shapes my behavior. All through Chumash. Remember the Exodus, it shapes your behavior. It makes you sensitive. All through Chumash. There's a law about being sensitive and kind to less fortunate people. Remember you were a slave in Egypt. Remember you were a stranger. Remember how you were mistreated. Redeem your history. And that memory is a transformative memory. That's why we mention it every day in Shema. It's not just saying thank you. It's remembering why you're chosen and why God put you through that question. Now we'll get to the circular reasoning that Harold asked. Because what would a chutzpahdik son ask? If I'm thanking God for taking me out of Egypt to be his people, why'd you put me there in the first place? Don't put me in, don't take me out. But if I appreciate that my experience in Egypt was basic training, it was collective experience of suffering to teach us what it feels like to be oppressed. And we as God's people can't do that to others. We have to be kind and benevolent and always thinking of other people. Then that memory shapes my behavior every day. It's a transformative memory that makes me who I am. And therefore, every day we have to remember the Exodus. On the other hand, one day a year I go crazy about it. I sort of like I recharge my batteries once a year. And that's why I quote, if I go back to the Haggadah now, that's why I quote Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah. Of all those conversations that night between the rabbis, I'm not going to quote all of them. I quote the most important one. I purposely quote Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah's conversation of why every day and every night, why this obsession every day and every night. And he quotes a pasuk from Devarim. That's from Sefer. Let me show you where that is real fast. Stop the share and wait, is it here? Wait, my mistake. Second, go back, share screen. Here we are. In Devarim chapter 16, here we are. You remember this, I'm sure. Remember Shmor Chodesh Aviv and do Pesach?
Yeah.
And don't eat matzah. Don't eat chametz. Eat matzah for 7 days. Keep a chipazon. And lechem oni is here's the source of lechem oni, which can mean either of the three. Eat matzah for 7 days. Conversation bread, a bread that reminds you of affliction, or poor man's bread. But I think conversation bread or bread that reminds you of your affliction both make perfect sense here, because you were rushed out of Egypt. But what's the purpose of the yearly celebration? The purpose of the yearly celebration is the daily celebration, is the daily memory. That's what I'm quoting that pasuk for, because that's, if I'm going to make a big deal once a year about the Exodus, I need to remember why God took me out of Egypt, because that memory is going to shape my day-to-day behavior. Remember why I'm chosen. Now, if I want to go to the, and I think that observes the circular reasoning, that the main goal, God wants a nation, that's why he gave us a land, that's why he gave us mitzvot, but he put us through the suffering, and that was God's forecasting in Beit Tarim. To become God's nation, there was a need to go through basic training of suffering under of another tyrant, so we know how to behave once we become a nation, to make sure that we don't do that to others, and we be a model that other nations can learn from. One last thing, yeah. So that was
Question:
yeah, sure, go ahead.
Why did the Chachamim cut down the eating of matzah to the first night of Pesach holy?
Okay,
Given
perfect.
the person
You couldn't ask the question in a better time. Perfect question. I'll explain Phil's question, which was my question in the beginning.
Yeah.
Asking, if the main thing is eating matzah is our Crispix in our analogy. If eating matzah is the main thing, and that reminds me of the Exodus, why is there such an accent on no chametz? Which goes back to our first thing. Why does God say, remember this day you left Egypt once a year, and don't eat chametz, say eat matzah? That's the biggest question, isn't it? And 7 times in Chumash it says eat matzah for 7 days.
Yeah.
And the rabbis say no, only no chametz is the most important thing. It goes back to it's a whole long story, but it goes back to I have to maybe pick up one other source sheet. Let me stop this off. It goes back to Parshat Ve'era, the way it's understood in the book of Yechezkel. Chumash, Hashem. Before we left, I'm sorry, I didn't share my screen. There we go. Before we left Egypt, remember we read last week, God tells Moshe, Ani Hashem, I'm coming to fill my Beit, and tell Bnei Israel, Ani Hashem, I'm going to take you out of Egypt and save you, bring you to Har Sinai and bring you to the land, Ani Hashem. But they didn't buy it. They don't, remember, they don't obey Moshe, they don't listen to Moshe, they don't get it. They're just too distressed. It's over their head. Now, the way Chazal understand this is that we weren't ready yet for redemption. Now, in Yechezkel, and this will explain Chametz in a minute, hundreds of years later, right before the first temple was destroyed, Yechezkel was in Bavel with the first wave of exile. And the elders of the people who were exiled before the temple was destroyed are hoping to come back to Israel and want to get back to normalcy again. And they come to Yechezkel and Bavel say, pray to us, beg from God, take care of us and bring us back home. And God answers them back, tell them they don't deserve to be redeemed. He says, Tishpot otam, be judgmental of them, tell them how bad they are and why I'm bringing destruction. He says, Vamar, tell them, on the day I chose to take Israel out of Egypt, and I lifted my hand to them, I made myself known to them about all the miracles, and told them, Ani Hashem Elokechem. Yes, on that day, I lifted my hand, I wanted to take you out of Egypt the nice way. Listen carefully. Before redemption began, God demanded not just recognizing his existence, but a change of attitude. V'amar lehem, I told you back in Egypt, Ish shikutzei inav hashlichu uvegilu mitzrayim al titamau ani Hashem Elokechem. Get rid of your Egyptian ways. Get rid of your bad habits, your bad culture. Remember what Chazal say, we were in 49 levels of Tumah before we left Egypt? This is the source. He's telling the people, it's a Zohar, but the Zohar is based on these psukim in Yechezkel. I beg you before you left Egypt, get rid of your Egyptian ways. Get rid of your bad culture. Get rid of your Egyptian idol worship. Right? Ve'amruvi, you rebelled against me still in Egypt. V'lo avu lishmoila, you didn't obey me. Ish et shukitzei nav lo hishlichu. You didn't abandon your ways. And you know what? I should have wiped you out in Egypt. That's how bad you were. Remember? But I saved you L'man Shmi for the sake of my name, so it shouldn't be Chilo Hashem, so I had to save you because I promised. But you didn't deserve redemption. Now, Sefer Shemot gives us a very good excuse why we didn't have redemption, why we weren't ready, because in hindsight, Yechezkel is being really harsh. So I don't understands why we didn't change our ways. Because what do you want from them? We're slave people, we're oppressed. But that explains why our first mitzvah is Korban Pesach. As the first stage to get out of Egypt, God's going to tell us we need to do something to show God we're willing to reject Egyptian culture. And therefore, what's Korban Pesach? We burn an Egyptian god and we don't eat Egyptian bread. You follow? We sit down to a meal which is saying anti-Egyptian. And that's our first step. Now, if chametz is a symbol of Egyptian culture, assuming Egyptian culture is bad, then it's not enough to thank God for your redemption. I need to show God I'm willing to turn over a new leaf. I'm willing to get rid of my bad habits, my bad ways, okay, and accept something new. And before I can bring a Korban Pesach, what I need to do, I have to get rid of my chametz. Remember, lo tishchata chametz dam zivchi? And if I'm going to remember redemption, and I need to be deserving of redemption, the first stage of redemption is turning over a new leaf and getting rid of your bad behavior. And that's why Ledorot, what does chametz symbolize? In the beginning, it symbolized corrupt Egyptian culture. In the future, it represents whatever's bad in life, whatever's evil. Call it Yetzer Hara. Now, all the laws of chametz are laws of idol worship, aren't they? The same law, burning it, getting rid of it. You can't have any benefit from it. We treat chametz for 8 days, for 7 days, as though it's avodah zarah. You follow? Because it's symbolic. But what's it mean? Before I can thank God for my redemption, I need to remember why I'm redeemed. And the way you show God I remember why I'm redeemed, by getting rid of my bad habits, getting rid of my bad ways, and accepting new ways. And that's why getting rid of your chametz is symbolic of changing your lifestyle and being ready to accept a new way of life. That's why getting rid of your chametz is more important than eating matzah. I think that's a rabbinic understanding. The main mitzvah is v'lo yechal chametz. Because if I want to remember the Exodus, I need to remember why I was chosen. Not only why to serve God, but that makes it incumbent upon me to change my ways and get rid of my bad habits. And therefore, if I understand it thematically, if I go back to that first pasuk that we quoted in the beginning, God says, remember this day you left Egypt. And remember this day you left Egypt. And that God took you out of Egypt. How do you remember? Get rid of your bad habits. Get rid of your chametz. And then, after you get rid of your chametz, then you can eat matzah for 7 days. But I can't see and can't own matzah. I got to sort of clean house once a year, spring cleaning. And then explain to your children, when you eat matzah, explain to your children the reason why God took me out of Egypt was to keep his mitzvot, like eating matzah. And the way I get ready for it is by getting rid of my chametz.
If chametz is bad, then why shouldn't we eat it shouldn't eat it 365 days a year?
Because it's nothing intrinsically bad. It represents what's bad. When we left Egypt, it represented Egyptian culture. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with chametz. It might symbolize, haughtiness and things like that. Ask your local Hasidic Sharov what it symbolizes. But it's nothing wrong in itself as long as it's understood properly.
As long as you put it to yours, it serves you instead of you serving it.
Yeah, but that's the beauty of it. It becomes a symbol of what's bad. And therefore, we make chametz bad. We define it as bad, and therefore it needs to symbolize the need to get rid of what's bad. But we eat chametz because you can't go crazy all year long and have chametz. It's probably...
That doesn't answer why we don't eat matzah for the 7 days, which the Torah itself.
The Rambam holds it's a mitzvah to say, but the main, it's put it this way. Chumash put such a big emphasis. I'll tell you what they make it like. It's just like Chumash says you're supposed to work 6 days a week, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
But we don't paskin that way, do we?
Everybody talks about it. Nobody does it.
No one does. But why does Chumash say you have to work 6 days a week?
Every time it says
you keep Shabbos, but you can't work on Shabbos. Right. Got it? So the same thing. Eat matzah for 7 days because you can't have chametz. But the main thing is no chametz. Once I say you can't have chametz, okay, therefore you have matzah, nothing else you can eat. But the matzah at the Seder night, it's the matzah of the Korban Pesach. That's a symbolic one. That matzah you have to eat. Okay? The matzah we eat at the Seder is matzah of getting rid of your Egyptian way of life. Because that we say, the matzah of Korban Pesach, a matzot nechluah, that's the chiyuv d'oraita. Now, we eat matzah for 7 days to remember the reason for that original matzah.
Yeah.
But the main mitzvah is for the first week of the spring, no chametz. It means get rid of your bad ways. That's how you start the spring. That's how you start a new year.
But
It's almost
interesting.
parallel. It's almost exactly like Elul, 6 months off. Just like we get rid of, like in Elul, we get rid of all of our bad behavior. We do tshuva. We're doing the same thing in the beginning of the spring.
But there's a specific pasuk that says Shavs Yom Torah Matzah.
Yeah, but the rabbis were kofrim. They weren't Karaites. The Karaites, for sure, of course, you have to eat matzah for 7 days. But it's interesting. Again, it's a machloket. Rambam holds there's you fulfill mitzvah by eating it. You don't have to. That's what they're saying. Saying you should eat matzah for 7 days, but you don't have to eat every single day. It's not like eating in the sukkah every day. That's what they compare it to sometimes. But they're putting such an emphasis on getting rid of your chametz more than eating matzah.
It's a stretch.
It's not I eat matzah because I might come to eat chametz. The main mitzvah is no chametz allowed. There's such an emphasis. Remember, you can't own it. You can't see it. Got to get rid of it. Pure in chiyuv karet. Chiyuv karet on chametz is amazing, isn't it? Chiyuv karet, because what's it mean? Because if you don't understand that being a covenantal partner with God is incumbent upon you to get rid of your bad behavior, then you're not part of the covenant. Let's understand your covenantal commitment to God has to come along with proper behavior, which begins with getting rid of bad behavior, introspection, getting rid of what's bad, and then you take on good.
But what would have harmed them to say it's a mitzvah every day to eat matzah?
Why shouldn't you? No, it's a mitzvah every day.
That's what we remember.
What?
The memory is the eating of matzah.
So the way we do it, we do it in saying Shema every day, don't we? In Parshat Tzitzit?
Yeah.
If we ate matzah every day, then no day would be special. You follow? No. If we could only make all day long, we would know what chametz is. It would be like it's not kosher. You follow? And it wouldn't be anything special because it's part of our norm. We say it's like not kosher. Okay. The fact we don't eat pig every day doesn't remind us of anything.
So what do you do with the pasuk?
Imagine if you could eat bacon all year long, and 1 week you couldn't eat bacon. Then that would make it special. But because once a year you don't eat it, that makes it special that one time a year. But again, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with chametz itself. It's what it's symbolic of during that 1 week.
Well, that part is straightforward. But basically, here you got a straight pasuk that tells you to eat matzah 7 days.
Uh-huh. 7 times it says that. Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with your question, but you have to ask your local rabbi.
As he says.
The rabbinic interpretation is this. I told you, the Rambam holds it to mitzvah taseh, think to eat matzah during the 7 days. The Gra would held that also. But from the pure halachic viewpoint, it's one of the mitzvot where the rabbis have a certain thematic understanding, and then they read the pasukim the way they want to.
Yeah.
Listen, what I'll give you the best example, and we'll end with a share with that. What pasuk the rabbis use to say you're only chayiv the first night? Remember, you're not chayiv 7 days, but what pasuk do they quote that you're only chayiv the first night? Who remembers?
There's a pasuk that says Sheished Yamim.
No. It says there's be'erev tochlu matzot. Remember that?
Yeah.
That's what the rabbis quote. How do we know you only chayiv the first night? Be'erev tochlu matzot, right?
So it's
now,
error. So that means one.
Yeah. So listen what the rabbis are quoting from. They're going to pull a fast one on you. Look at this. Look what they do. The rabbis are awesome. You have to appreciate how they do. Here, it's in Perek Yud Bet. They say as follows. It's the end of Parshat Chodesh. Okay, it says Shivat Yamim Matzot Yochelu. Go argue with the pasuk. Eat matzah right away. Eat matzah for 7 days. Got it? And on Rishon, get rid of your chametz already from the beginning. Why? Why? Because if you eat chametz, you're chayiv karet. So it's almost like eat matzah to make sure you don't eat chametz. Okay. Now, on the first day have a mikra kodesh, on the last day, and ochel nefesh is permitted. Okay, eat matzah, keep the matzot because that's the day that God's taking you out of Egypt. Now listen carefully. Pasuk Yitchet. Barishon, right? In the first month. Okay, ba'arba'asar yom lechodesh be'erev tochlu matzot ad yom echad v'esrim lechodesh be'erev. Means from the first day from the 14th day of the first month until the 21st day, eat matzah, which means eat matzah for 7 days. What do the rabbis do? They truncate the pasuk and they read just this.
Be'erev. Yeah.
Be'erev tochlu matzot. And that's the rabbinic source why you're only chayiv the first night. That's what the Gemara quotes. And that's what all the rabbis say. This is a source to only chayiv the first night from Be'er Techlu Matzot. And that phrase is embedded in a pasuk that says eat matzah for 7 days.
Yeah.
How much you appreciate the rabbis. They're onto something.
Very good. Very good.
Now, but when people learn the Gemara, they think there's a pasuk that says Be'er Techlu Matzot. But they're messing with you, the rabbis. You follow? They're taking a pasuk that says eat matzah for 7 days. The whole context is eating matzah for 7 days. Look, okay. But what happens next? But they're right. But they know what they're doing because the next line is 7 days. You can't have soor in your house, and you're chayiv karet if you have soor. The accent here is no chametz. You follow?
Yeah.
What these psukim are screaming is that eating matzah for 7 days is in order not to have chametz for a week. But the main commandment is no chametz, chiyuv karet. And therefore, in that context, they're quoting this pasuk out of context in its pasuk, but in the context of the whole section.
But it means if a family does not eats matzah the first night only, does not eat matzah or chametz, he's fulfilled the halacha.
Yeah, for sure, he did nothing wrong. And it's a hit or miss if you go to a hotel and they make you They make you kosher for Pesach buns and kosher for Pesach waffles and kosher for Pesach pancakes.
It's a stretch.
You can spend a whole week. I agree with the Ram. I think you should eat matzah every day. I think most people hold it's a mitzvah to have matzah. There's a kiyum. Are you chayiv like mamish chayiv? I don't think they're saying you're not chayiv like the night. They're emphasizing the chiyuv of the first night.
Okay.
But isn't there another pasuk in in Emor or Re'eh that says Sheshet Yamim something ... and that's how they chazal. That's how they darshan Sheshet Yamim versus Shivat Yamim. The difference is 1 day, and therefore they darshan that the chiyuv is 1 day.
Your answer is what you just said. That's how they darshan. Let me show you.
That's how they darshan.
Yeah.
We're somewhere.
Why?
I'll show you what the rabbis do. Bible, 1 second. Deuteronomy 16. Here's what the rabbis do.
Where it's in Re'eh.
Same thing we saw before. Keep them out to the spring. Got it? Don't now. Listen is how it writes it. Bring korban pesach in the spring. Lo tochal lav chametz. Got it? No chametz allowed with korban pesach. Instead, eat matzah for 7 days. Got it? The main mitzvah is no. Remember, we saw the same thing in Shmot. Remember this day, v'lo yechal chametz. Therefore, eat matzah for 7 days. Chumash is on. The rabbis are reading very carefully. You follow? A cursory reading would say, like you're saying, it says eat matzah for 7 days. When you look carefully, Chumash is putting a much more of an emphasis on no chametz, much more than eating matzah.
Yeah,
we saw that in Perek Yud Gimel. How started share v'lo yechal chametz before we got to Levincha. Now, then it says don't chametz, eat matzah for 7 days. Here it says shivat matzah yachal dachem oni. In order to remember every day of your life. No seor again, 7 days. Got it? And then you have to record Pesach on Kol Mashiach Hashem.
Sheshet Yamim Tochal Matzot.
Yeah, here. Now, Sheshim Tochal Matzot, Uvyom Hashvi Atzeret L'Hashem Elokecha. What are these 6 days? What a machloket in Pshat? It's that in addition to the first day, got it? Another 6 days you eat matzah. In other words, it says beforehand, Shivat Yamim Tochal Lav Matzot. So you can't say that Sheish Yamim means you don't eat matzah for only 6 days and not 7 days. But rather, this is building up to Atzeret, right? So it could be in addition to the first day, you eat another 6 days. And on that 6th day, after the last 6 days, which now ends up on the 7th day, you make an Atzeret L'Hashem Elokecha. That could be. Or it could be, you eat matzah for 6 days. It's a build up for the 7th day, which is the last day of Yom Tov. It's a big machloket. Are the Sheish Yamim the first 6 days or the last 6 days of Pesach, and how they relate to Yom Hashvi. But you can't say that this is saying you only chayiv 6 days. So the rabbis do a whole limud here. If 6 days can't be a chiyuv because it says 7 days, therefore they're all only chayiv the first night.
Right.
That's where they start the chiyuv from. But they're not when the rabbis quote this pasuk to get to only chayiv the first night. They're drawing a circle around the target. You follow? They know where they want to go. No, they want to say you only have the first night, and they're playing games to get to the first night. What my point is the rabbis understand, based on super pshat of Chumash, that the main commandment is no chametz.
Right.
And therefore, if that's the case, then I don't have to eat matzah at all. What's special about the first night? No, the first night you have to have matzah. But that goes back to Korban Pesach. That's a question. Is our chiyuv to eat matzah the first night because of Parshat, because of Be'erev tuchlu matzot, or because al matzot umim tuchlua? There's two holidays. There's Korban Pesach. We Korban Pesach with matzah, and then there's 7 days of no chametz.
Yeah.
And the matzah we're eating at night is because of Korban Pesach, not because of eating matzah for 7 days. But they overlap the first night. Now there's a 1-day holiday called Pesach, which starts on the 14th in the morning and ends on the 15th in the morning. And there's a holiday of 7 days of Chag HaMatzot, and they overlap that night. Got it? If you know that there's a Mikdash holiday. Remember the Mikdash day begins in the morning?
Yeah.
The Mikdash holiday of Passover starts sunrise to sunrise. It's the 14th going into the 15th. And the Gevuli mitzvah of eating matzah, of not having chametz for 7 days, starts at the 15th at night and goes to the 21st. You follow? Those two commandments overlap that night. And that's why the commandment to eat matzah is on that night that they overlap. It's like two related holidays that overlap overnight. Because I read that put it this way, even if we didn't leave Egypt that night, we'd still have to bring Korban Pesach to remember God saved me from Makat Bechorot. In other words, if God only saved me from Makat Bechorot and didn't take me out of Egypt that night, I'd still have to say thank you. Remember Dayenu? But it just so happened, now that he saved us that night from Makat Bechorot, he also took us out of Egypt that night. It was like an exciting night, and therefore they overlap both of them. Anyway, I went way over time. I'm sorry. I didn't realize how late it was.
Sorry, it's appreciated.
Okay, no problem. But I know people probably need to go already. So we'll stop here. I'll still answer questions still, but it's a major topic. What I try to show you today, because it's Parshat Bo, when you read Parshat Bo carefully, you check all the things and check every time it talks about eating matzah, it's always the focus is going to be more. The focus will be more not having chametz. It's like work 6 days a week, but can't work on Saturday. In other words, it's a build up to not working on Saturday, eating matzah, not working 6 days a week. Same way, eat matzah for 7 days because you're not working on, because you can't have chametz, yet therefore you end up eating matzah.
But it is meant to work 6 days a week too.
If it was, we'd solve a lot of financial crises in yeshivas.
Yes, we would.
Who are you?
That's the Marxist approach.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. This is Fliegler. Okay.
And so everyone have a good week and stay healthy. And I guess you guys, I'm assuming you're all vaccinated by now.
And thanks.
Our age group, yeah. I got my second shot over a week ago. So.
Right. Okay.
Anyway, have a good week, everyone. I'll stop the share here.
רב מנחם, אנחנו סיימנו, נכון?
כן, תודה רבה.
טוב, כל טוב, בריאות, שבת שלום.
Shabbat shalom.